So, welcome to the lecture, Agriculture and Economic Growth. As I stated earlier, you can access the outline for this lecture on Blackboard, like this one, and then download it to take notes. Each lecture outline has a thesis statement as well. This is what I'm arguing in this lecture. In this case, as you can see, I'm arguing that the adoption of agriculture allowed economic growth and increasing population density, both of which aided in the specialization of human function. It led, therefore, to hierarchical, economically unequal, but prosperous societies around the globe. In this course, one thing I want you to learn is how to write what historians call an identification, or ID, how to identify the person, place, or thing, the event or historical process. You'll be writing quite a lot of these one-paragraph identifications in this course. And you do it by telling the reader who, what, when, where, why. And the why is really about significance. So look at the outline and its argument. The outline tells you the who and where. These are the populations that are most central to the story I'm going to tell, the history of the US to 1877, and where they come from. The what is also clear from the first part of the argument. This is a history of the adoption of agriculture and its social and political effects. There are some dates to tell you when, and my argument begins to tell you why, or significance. That the adoption of agriculture led to hierarchical societies, and this happened in the three parts of the world that participate in the bigger story I'm going to tell over the course of the whole semester, and the argument I'm going to make about the cause of the Civil War. So let's begin. My version of history begins with the adoption of agriculture because agriculture makes everything else possible. For most of human prehistory, in other words, before written records, everybody had to make their own food. Before agriculture, people ate what they got from hunting, fishing, or foraging, what they found or killed, and it had to be eaten right away. On the other hand, farming usually leads to the creation of a surplus, a little extra food that can be stored or traded. For this reason, because agriculture creates a surplus, it leads to specialization of human function and social stratification. Since there's extra, it means that not everybody has to make their own food. There's room for people to do something else. Like me, I'm a history professor. Like you're college students. It lets you do something else to earn money that you then use to buy food that someone else grew. And agriculture is the reason for that.
Who's that then? I don't know. Must be a king. Come on. He hasn't got shit all over him.
So we'll study how agriculture developed in three places around the globe, places crucial for understanding American history. We begin in Africa, because that's where human life began, around 120,000 years ago and spreading out from there, up Africa, and east and west into its extremities, up into Central Europe, and from there into the region we call Europe. At the same time, along the subcontinent. This is India, a big triangle sticking out into the Indian Ocean, off the east coast of Africa. The Horn of Africa, this bit is called. Populations moved through Asia and on to Australia, while parallel movements took humans across Upper Asia, here, this shows the bigger picture, over a land bridge, into the Americas, down across the North American continent and into South America, all from Africa. Now, this is an argument that comes from evolutionary biology, with its grasp of really big timescales. It helps us set the stage for the really big history that leads into more specific American history. It also helps us to understand how big Africa is, and Africa is really big. This map doesn't capture how big Africa really is. It's distorted because of the way it projects the globe of the Earth onto a flat screen. In order to reproduce the globe of the Earth onto a flat piece of paper, you have to make some choices. about how you will project the globe onto the flat surface, and this map uses the Mercator projection, as it's called. The choices made by Mercator involved compressing the grid at the middle and stretching it out at the top and the bottom. But that exaggerates the size of the extremities, the top and the bottom. This square and this are longer than they would be in real life on the globe. On the real physical globe, Africa is so large that you can fit most of the rest of the world onto it. Okay, not the whole world, but America, Eastern Europe, France, Spain, China, India, plus space for New Zealand, and so on. It's a big, big place. So this means that when we talk about Africa, we should talk about very specific parts of Africa. And in this class, I'm mostly interested in West Africa. I'm going to speak primarily about a particular corner of one of Africa's sides, which is the part of Africa from which most African Americans come. For this reason, West African history matters more in this class than the rest of the continent. West Africa, below the Sahara Desert, between the Senegal and the Niger rivers. Here, along this coast, where the rivers meet the sea and flow in and out with the tide. The water in the rivers is sometimes salty and sometimes fresh. Here, the adoption of agriculture took the form of rice cultivation. Rice. Even today, 50% of the world's population relies on rice for 80% of its caloric intake. That means that it is the staple grain for half of the world's population, and its cultivation is very important in world history and in US history as well. Rice is grown in paddies. This is a field filled with water. And at some points in its life cycle, rice needs more water, and sometimes it needs less. So growing rice relies on irrigation and controlling how much water is in a rice paddy. Here, you can see the walls that link a system of paddies for water control. It's a system like this one, where you can see that a spare tube rests atop the walls that separate one rice paddy from another. Altogether, a sophisticated system of irrigation and water control to maintain a food supply. Irrigating like this requires complex decision-making and the allocation of resources and efforts, but growing rice allows for populations to grow and settle on one spot instead of chasing after animals to hunt them down or foraging for food. Look at all the tribes that developed and settled along these waterways. Here, on the west coast of Africa, a sophisticated system of irrigation and water control to maintain a food supply, allowing for dense populations settled on one spot. As we know, these were slave societies, and that means, of course, a social structure that's unequal and hierarchical. But it was somewhat different from European slavery. It was really a means of organizing society according to labor, instead of land or other material possessions. For most of these tribes, there was no ownership of land. Instead, people owned labor, their own, that of their families, that of their slaves. If you were captured in a war, or if your tribe lost a war, you might owe your labor to someone else. You would be their slave. You could be a slave and still the chief of a tribe. Although this was different from European capitalist societies that would come into contact with Africa, it did provide a basis for selling people's labor into the ships that would soon arrive to transport them across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. And there, in the Americas, a different staple grain shaped the society and the economy. A society both different from Africans and similar to it in certain ways. Here, maize and the system for cultivating it shaped a different culture. Rather than irrigation, here I'm going to describe a system of intercropping and the Three Sisters system of agriculture. Maize is a word for corn, and it is the grain of the Americas. Human evolution on the North and South American continents is bound up with the domestication of corn into a crop you can grow, because corn cannot actually reproduce itself without help. Corn requires intervention of humans or of insects, usually, in order to make more corn. Corn is basically a big blade of grass. The leaves are called blades, and the tassel on top contains the pollen. And there at the nodes, Where the blades of the plant grow from the stem, little buds grow. These buds are clustered into ears of corn. They are the individual niblets. And each individual bit of corn has silk that extends from it and can catch any pollen that is shaken from the tassel, and then carries it to the buds on the ear of the corn. Because humans often help the process of pollination for corn, corn is tied into a lot of the creation myths in the religions of the native tribes of Mesoamerica and the southern parts of the United States. In these myths, the creation of maize and the creation of humans go hand in hand. For example, in the Mayan culture, the Mayans believed that the gods made 3 efforts to establish humanity. First, God made a man of mud, but he dried up and blew away. To make a more durable creature, God made a man of wood, but he had no soul to worship his maker. So God made a 3rd try and made a man of corn, who grew up and offered a sacrifice of himself. Corn grew up to be eaten by the gods in a self-perpetuating cycle. Other myths include the Cherokee tribe, whose origin myth includes the story of Silu, the first woman, and she had 2 sons. And, like growing boys the world over, they were always hungry. So Silu went out to get food and came back with corn and beans. And the boys wanted to know where all that food came from. So one day, they begged her for food, and when she went out to get some, they followed her and saw that she went into a little hut and rubbed her sides, and beans appeared around her. And she rubbed her stomach, and corn would appear. Her name means corn in the Cherokee language. That's how much the myth of the first humans is tied to the creation of corn in Cherokee society. According to the scientists, maize or corn was domesticated around Tehuaca in the century 4000 to 3000 BCE. Domesticated means that humans began to cultivate it for their own use. And BCE means before the Common Era. It's the scientific version of BC, or before Christ. So, corn was domesticated in South America about 4,000 or 3,000 years before the Common Era. The transition to an agriculture-based society was complete by about 1000 BCE, and agricultural societies were spreading. Corn was not grown by itself. It was grown alongside beans and squash in the same field, a process known as intercropping. Corn, beans, squash, the 3 sisters of Native American agriculture. Because the corn shields the lower growing plants, and they cover the ground between the stalks of corn, intercropping keeps pests and weeds away from the fields. It's a very efficient method of agriculture. Moreover, the 3 foods together make a perfect protein, so it was possible to get a fully nutritious diet out of one single field. And this system was based around growing corn. In order to make the fields in which to grow the 3 sisters, Native Americans would girdle trees, cut off a girdle of bark, and let the tree slowly die from exposure. This cleared the land for agriculture. It was slow, but it worked. And as corn domesticated, certainly by 1000 BCE, the American tribes developed a series of civilizations, unequal societies based on agriculture, making a little extra to sell or exchange. Okay, I've gotten us to this point here on the outline, to the end of Maize and the 3 sisters. And remember that the lecture as a whole is talking about how the adoption of agriculture led to hierarchical societies around the world. So let's turn to the societies based around the cultivation of corn in the Americas. First, I'm going to discuss 3 famous ancient American societies: the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas. They'll be important in upcoming lectures when Europeans arrive. Remember, the who of the lecture is the population of American history, so these civilizations will appear next time. Let's start with the Mayan culture, which developed between 250 and 900 CE. That's the Common Era, after the birth of Christ, here on the Yucatan Peninsula. Here at the top of the peninsula, you can see Chichen Itza, the great city of the Mayan culture. where they worship the gods who made men out of corn in order to sustain themselves. This is the famous pyramid at Chichen Itza, which reflects the organization of Mayan society. You can see that down here at the bottom you've got people growing corn, and because they make a surplus of food more than they need, their food supports everybody above them in the pyramid. Here you've got people dancing and trading. Their clothes get fancier as you go up the pyramid, and here at the very top is a king, or god, who looks a little like a corn plant, if I may. We know the civilization came to an end about 900 years after the birth of Christ, and we don't know a lot of the reason why. We know the end was violent. We can see in the archaeological record that there was war or weapons and fighting, and the Mayan civilization crumbled. This indicates that unequal societies are also unstable, that fighting can overtake them when some people make the food and others wear the fancy clothes. 500 years later, we see another civilization in Mesoamerica, present-day Mexico, and these were the Aztecs. Their main city was Tenochtitlan, on the site of present-day Mexico City. The Aztec culture seems to have formed from an alliance of 3 powerful tribes. And Aztec culture is the original and native culture of Mexico. While the origins of the Aztecs are uncertain, they have a very clear endpoint in 1520. I'll talk about how that happened in the upcoming lectures about Columbus and the Spanish Empire. Likewise, with the Incan civilization, which flourished between 1197 and 1532 in the Common Era, the Inca also have a clear end date. Inca tribes lived on the west coast of South America, not Mesoamerica. My outline oversimplified things a little bit. The Incas lived in what is the nation of Peru in the present day. This is a mountainous area, and in order to cultivate corn, they had to clear fields in the mountainside. Here's one of their stone villages, and here a closer view of how they built those stone buildings, just by fitting together rocks, no concrete or glue to set them in place. Just perfectly fitted rocks that they formed into walls and buildings. They built these walls in order to terrace the mountainsides. They made flat fields and walled them off with stone, and grew corn to create a settled society. So, Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas, corn-based societies from the regions where corn was first domesticated. But also, on the North American continent, the cultivation of corn influenced the establishment of complex societies with a lot of layers. Archaeologists call these Mississippian civilizations. These were individual tribes across the southeastern parts of North America, tribes that were connected and interrelated, and their main city was called Cahokia. This is a reconstruction of what it must have looked like based on archaeology, and this is the site today. Cahokia is near the city that today is East St. Louis, and it's a national park. It was a large and complex city here at the juncture of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. Cahokia was larger than London was in 1260. There was not a larger city in the United States until 1800, and it was built on the exchange of corn grown by the Mississippian tribes that supported people who lived in the city and did not make their own food. Unequal societies based on agriculture. To this story of agriculture and social differentiation, Northern Europe was a latecomer. Its people were hunting and fishing and foraging, painting themselves blue and worshipping bears until they began to cultivate staple crops, grains. Instead of rice or corn, Northern Europeans grew wheat, oats, and barley. But the soil was really thick and clay-like in lots of Northern Europe, so it was hard to really dig in and grow these crops. This is a soil map, and the dark parts are like clay, hard to grow grains in. But in Italy, Spain, Southern Europe, the soils were more sandy and drainage was good. It was easier to grow stuff. The same was true of the Middle East, what was called the Fertile Crescent. In Egypt and Kurdistan and Orissa. Here's the Mediterranean Sea, and this is Spain, Italy. And you can see the connection between Europe and the Middle East. European agriculture began there, with people who used a little stick plow called the ard. Here's one that archaeologists found. And here are other versions that developed across the Fertile Crescent. These variations were kind of simple dragging tools that you could use to dig small trenches to put seeds in and grow grains. The image below is called the heavy plow, which you can see as a sturdier implement. It has a metal tip called the coulter that digs a trench through a heavy soil and turns it over, so you've got a good little ditch and a little hill running beside it, all very useful for putting seeds in and growing, for drainage or for coverage. We begin to see remnants of the heavy plow appear in the historical and archaeological record between the 700s and the 900s CE in Europe, about 700 years after the birth of Christ. Heavy plows show that northern Europeans were growing crops and adopting agriculture to maintain settled societies. But the heavy plow is heavy. You couldn't just drag it around. You had to really drive it through the soil. And so people who used heavy plows also had livestock, usually oxen. Hitch a lot of bulls to that plow, and you could drag it through even clay. But having both a plow and a lot of oxen to drag it, not everybody can afford that when you only need it for part of the year. So what we see is that Europeans shared these resources and made decisions together about how they would be used. They would share out the oxen, and this indicates a fairly complex society and decision-making that could allocate resources to agriculture. These heavy plows carved fields more than 1,000 years ago, and their marks on the earth are still visible today, here. And in snow, you can see it even better. Old fields and remnants of past societies. People would live in villages like this one, usually around a church building or the manor house that owned the land, and then farm the fields on the outskirts in these long strips because they were using oxen to drag a heavy plow. Another example of the strips, with stone walls marking individual holdings, generally enclosed in more modern times. Here's a reconstruction of medieval European agriculture. You can see that it's called the three-field system because this was a technological breakthrough as important as the heavy plow. Because people had to have livestock to pull their plows. They had to grow enough food for themselves and also for the livestock, for their oxen, to keep them alive and pull the plows. They did this by using a three-field system of agriculture. They'd grow 3 crops on one piece of land in succession. One year they'd grow wheat, another year they'd grow barley or oats, and then they'd let the field rest or lie fallow for a year. But they'd alternate what was growing where. So there was always a supply of wheat growing on 1/3 of the fields and other crops on the other third, and the last third of the fields would rest for the next cultivation cycle. You can imagine that the society which decided which fields grew what and which used plows and oxen in which years was a complicated process, and it is from this allocation of resources that we see the specialization of human function, the unequal societies that developed in medieval Europe. Peasants would till the soil and feed people above them, knights and warriors, a system stretching all the way up to royalty, the people who owned the land that others cultivated. Here, you can see a clearer sense of how the system worked. Everybody owed obligations to somebody else, to people above them and below them, and these complicated societies made people in the towns, people who did not need to grow their own food, but instead fight wars or run the markets. And at the bottom, these peasants who grew the food that created a surplus, that created this complex society. So, to conclude, in Africa, in the American continents, and in Europe, agriculture led to surplus food, led to differentiation in society. In different ways, each of these regions grew different grains, and their technological systems shaped the societies in which they operated. Some people made food that supported the rest. This created settled populations, living in one place and living closely together, making population density in these 3 locations around the globe. The interactions among these societies will be our next topic, when Columbus sets sail and puts these cultures in contact with one another. That's where I'll pick up the story next time.